This case is one of America's most brutal crimes, and it's been haunting me ever since I heard about it. But what makes this case so terrifying is that even today, after all these years, nobody knows who did it or why. This is the VCSA case, one of the most brutal murders in U.S. history. It was June 1912 when 8 people were found brutally murdered in their home in Villisca, Iowa. The victims were Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and 2 of their friends. They were all found lying in their beds with their heads smashed in. But as gruesome as this wasn't even the beginning of the story. Authorities didn't actually realize that there had been a murder until 7 days later when a real estate agent named Jacob Caldwell went to the house to meet with Josiah about selling his property. When he got to the house, he noticed that the shades were drawn and the front door was locked. So he tried to get in through an unlocked window, but he soon ran back outside screaming. He had just seen something that no person should ever have to see. He called the sheriff right away, and when they arrived, they found 8 bodies in total. Josiah and Sarah were found in their bed together, and their 4 children were found in their beds around them. Then, in another room, they found the 2 friends that had been visiting the family, also in their beds. All 8 people had been bludgeoned to death, but the weapon hadn't been found yet. The police searched the entire house and the surrounding area, but they didn't find any signs of a struggle, which was strange considering how many people were killed. There were no signs of robbery either, so the police were totally stumped. There was also no sign of the weapon used to kill the victims, although authorities believe that it was probably some sort of heavy blunt object. To make things even stranger, apparently there had been thunderstorms in the area the night of the murders, but none of the windows in the house were open and none of the screens were damaged. In fact, the only way that someone could have gotten into the house was through the front door because all the windows were locked from the inside. But the door was also locked from the inside, and there was no evidence of forced entry. So the question is, how did the killer or killers get in and out of the house without anyone noticing? Well, they weren't able to answer that question, and we still don't know the answer today. And there were even more strange details about this case that the police couldn't explain. For example, there was no blood on the walls or the bed sheets, even though the victims' heads had been smashed in. It was like whoever had done this had somehow managed to not get any blood on anything. Also, 2 of the children had been awoken in the middle of the night and had gone to get a drink of water, but they hadn't been harmed. And strangely, they seemed completely fine with the rest of their family being murdered. What's even stranger is that afterwards, they just went back to bed and slept until morning, even though they had seen or experienced something so traumatic that it would affect them for the rest of their lives. And of course, there was the strange detail that all 8 victims were found fully clothed in their beds. There was nothing stolen, so there was no apparent motive for the crime, and the killer or killers had apparently taken great pains to avoid leaving any trace of themselves behind. The case immediately became a media sensation, and everybody wanted to know who could have done such a thing. In the weeks after the discovery of the bodies, several men came forward claiming to have seen strange lights around the house the night of the murders, but they hadn't reported it at the time. Some witnesses said that they had seen shadowy figures running from the scene of the crime, but they couldn't identify them. As the investigation continued, the police began to suspect that maybe Josiah had done the murders himself and then killed his entire family to cover up his crime. But after searching the house, they didn't find any evidence to support this theory. And then, as the years passed, the case went from being a local story to an international mystery. People all over the world were fascinated by the case, and dozens of books and articles were written about it. But even today, no one knows what happened in that house in Villisca. In 1913, John Oren, who was the sheriff at the time, put together a list of suspects, but he never publicly revealed their names. However, he did reveal that most of the suspects were drifters who had come through town right around the time of the murders. One of these men was John Hawk, who had been staying at the house across the street from the Moores. According to reports, Hawk was angry at Josiah because he had complained about him having chickens run loose. And according to John, he had a large axe in his room, which could have been used as a murder weapon. But when the police searched his room, they didn't find any such axe, and Hawk himself insisted that he had never owned one. Another man who was considered a suspect was George Kelly, who had been hired by Josiah to build a granary. But again, when the police investigated, they found no evidence to connect him to the crime. In fact, they found no evidence to connect any of the suspects to the crime. And after all these years, the case remains unsolved. But there is one piece of physical evidence that has stuck around. A blood-stained pillowcase was taken from the scene, but DNA testing in 2006 was unable to find any usable DNA on it. Even after all these years, the case continues to fascinate people. And in 2014, a team from the Discovery Channel came to Villisca to conduct their own investigation. They brought in forensic experts to re-examine the crime scene, but even they were unable to come up with any new leads. However, they did find a couple of interesting things. First of all, the team pointed out that there was blood spatter on the walls and the ceilings of the house that had been completely overlooked in the initial investigation. This made it clear that the murders had not happened in just one location, as originally thought, but had actually happened in several different places. They also discovered that someone had tried to clean the blood off the walls using a cloth. Unfortunately, this person had not cleaned very well and there was still blood left over. The team also pointed out that there were signs of a struggle in several of the rooms, which was odd because there was no sign of a struggle in the house at all. But the strangest thing that they found was a single drop of blood on the floorboard of the Moore's bedroom. When they tested it, they found that it was male DNA and that it belonged to someone who was definitely not related to any of the victims. This meant that there had been at least one male killer who had visited the home that night. And although this new evidence was helpful, it didn't exactly bring them closer to solving the case. Nobody knows whose blood that was or where it came from, and we still don't know what happened to the other suspects either. Did Hawk really kill the entire family with an axe? What about George Kelly? Or could there have been an unknown killer who was never caught? The truth is, we'll probably never know. I personally think that if it hadn't been for the fact that the case was so sensationalized in the media, the killer would have been caught long ago. But it is possible that the killer or killers will never be identified, and this case will remain a mystery forever. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think happened in Villisca? And do you think we'll ever find out the truth? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. I'd love to have you here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.